All right, I think we're going to get going to start. So good morning and good afternoon and evening to everybody joining us today for today's webinar entitled Rights and Resources, Fostering Gender Equality in Mining Legislation. My name is Nathan Schneck, and I have the pleasure of moderating our discussion today. I work as a consultant for the World Bank, where I manage the Delve platform, a global data and knowledge initiative focused on recognizing artisanal and small-scale mining's important contribution to global development. Today's webinar is our final in a three-part series of virtual events we put together celebrating the launch of the 2023 State of the ASM Sector Report. The report is a semi-annual flagship from the Delve initiative that analyzes the sector's linkages to Sustainable Development Goal. This year we focus on Sustainable Development Goal 5, gender equality, and we also use this report to highlight the work that's happening by a number of different organizations and researchers to support the ASM space. So we're really excited to have you here and to focus on this year's report, which examines the intersection of ASM and SDG 5, gender equality, and looks at the steps that are needed to achieve gender equality in the mining space. And so we are going to hear from a collection of report contributors and authors today in our discussion focused on gender equality in mining legislation. We'll hear from the report's coordinator, Aitai Mudameri, who will provide an overview of this year's report, and then we'll dig into the first chapter with our lead author, Professor Nelly Mutameri, discussing that chapter and its findings there. After that, we'll hear from a really interesting group of case study contributors from Colombia before we open it up for a panel discussion, and we'll be taking your questions for the different panelists. So please do be thinking about those and do put those into the chat as they come up during the conversation. Suzanne, if you want to go maybe to the next slide. Just a few housekeeping notes. Like I said before, make sure to set your language interpretation to your preferred setting. If it was English or Spanish, we have both of those options available today. You can do this by clicking the three dots above the word More in the Teams app up in the header, and that'll appear the option to choose language and speech, and then language interpretation is where you'll find the different audio options. Make sure to choose those. Additionally, like I said, submit your questions to us during the chat. We'd love to have those kind of prepped and ready before we jump into that panel discussion. So feel free to put those into the chat or the Q&A option during our conversation. And then I know Susan will also post in the chat a link to where you can find the report that we'll be talking about today, where you can download it, access a number of other pieces of content. We also have a great set of visualizations from the survey data that was developed through the report. So we encourage you to check out that website and explore all the content in the report that we have there as well. So we'll go to the next slide, Susan. Before we get into the meat of our discussion, I just want to offer a brief introduction to anyone who might not be familiar with artisanal and small-scale mining, or as we'll talk about it today, abbreviated ASM. The term ASM is used to describe a range of mining activities that occur at a smaller scale than industrial operators. This can mean a handful of people working together, upwards of several thousands, and it's primarily characterized by mining methods that employ basic tools and limited mechanization to extract and process a variety of minerals. ASM occurs across minerals, gold being the largest employer of ASM miners, but also we see ASM activity in gemstones, critical minerals like cobalt, tin, tantalum, tungsten, manganese, mica, and then also in the development mineral space in commodities like sand or stone aggregate and many more. The sector itself is a very important livelihood for rural populations across the world, with over 44 million people participating in this sector across 80 countries, from the Americas to Africa and to Asia. Small-scale miners are producing a number of minerals for the global economy and contributing to global development significantly. Women themselves play a critical role in the sector. As you'll see in the report, we estimate that 13.4 million women work in the ASM sector, roughly 30% of the global ASM workforce. Often women's contributions, though, are overshadowed by men who garner the lion's share of attention because of their work as primarily as digging and extracting the space. And you'll find in the report, we talk about women's contributions being marginalized, as they occur potentially on the periphery or in service roles at mine sites. But I think you also see, if you look into the report, we have a number of great examples of female leadership that demonstrate women's roles in mining organizations or as mining permit holders or mine operators. And so there's a lot to be done to continue to showcase that. Our discussion today is going to focus on the legal frameworks and the role of creating gender-sensitive legal frameworks in producing gender equality in the sector. And so before we hear from our different panelists, we're going to start off with a video from our report contributors, those that contribute case studies and other content to the report. So Susan, I'll turn it over to this video. Take a look. Excellent. I hope you enjoyed that video. Like I said, that's testimonies from a number of the different case study authors and contributors to the report. So it's a great kind of taste of the great case studies we have in the reports. I do encourage you to download it, check out those different case studies. They're really practical as well as clear examples of work being done in the sector across a diversity of contexts. We have, I think, 13 countries represented. And so right now, I just want to invite Aitai Mutameri to the stage. He's going to give us a broader sense of the context and scope of the 2023 report. Aitai, if you want to just unmute yourself and share your screen, we've got your slides up here. But just a little introduction, Aitai Mutameri is a data scientist with specializations in low carbon economic development policies, large-scale sustainability projects, and artisanal and small-scale mining. In the ASM sector, he's worked with the World Bank, Planet Gold, Pact, and Natural Resource Defense Council. He served this year as the main coordinator for the development of the 2023 report, including leading the design and execution of the global survey component. And he'll talk a little bit as well. So Itai, it's great to have you. And yeah, look forward to hearing from you, hear about the context of the report and what's gone into it.
Thank you, Nate, and thank you everybody for attending. And it's great to see so many familiar faces and names. Yes, I'll just run you through the report and sort of how we got to sort of develop the report and the structure that we did, and really how we executed it. So I think we'll start with some context. I can't. My slides have just disappeared. But the first DALV report really aims to set up the foundation and determine the state of data that we have in the ASM sector, right? So what we found was that there was a real global ASM data gap, and we found that many estimates on the number of people working in ASM were quite outdated. So, for example, when we read a report, typically you would see something like 1 million artisanal small-scale miners in Ghana, and the reference would be, for instance, Smith 2023. When you look at the source for that data point, it has in turn been referenced many times over the years. It's actually originally from a survey done by the ILO in, say, 1999. So this creates this is the issue called, well, typically referred to as data recycling. So the 2019 report therefore called for efforts to collect complete, accurate, and reliable data on the ASM sector, so we can demonstrate its economic importance, advocate for its formalization, start to implement evidence-based development programming. The 2020 report built on this foundation, and we focused on SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, to show how ASM can be a driver of wealth creation in local communities, and of course nationally. So through our analysis, what we found that we urgently needed to make investments in occupational health and safety, better economic and social data, especially on women's work in ASM, and gender disaggregated data in order to improve working conditions. The report featured 22 case studies contributed by 40 organizations, and it really sort of demonstrating the need for interventions in these areas. So I think on the next slide, fantastic. So the findings of the 2020 reports therefore inspired us to focus in the 2023 report on SDG 5, which is gender equality. So as is fitting with DELF, we probably should provide some extra data on the context of the report. So it has 3 chapters, the 2023 report. There are 14 case studies, and the case studies cover 12 countries across Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, and East Asia and the Pacific. It was contributed by 23 organizations, and many of them are here today. And thank you all so much for continuing to support DELF, to share your experiences, your data, and your expertise in a way to promote ASM formalization models. On the next slide, I'll just go through the approach for the paper. So what we did with the approach is I suppose we began with literature review, charting really the role of women in ASM and giving the background to the invisibility crisis of women's work in the ASM sector. Simply put, women were not being counted, certainly not anywhere as close to the frequency with which men are counted. Next, we undertook a legal analysis, and we reviewed the mining codes and relevant property laws in 21 countries around the world. And we found that 67% of mining codes and 80% of property right laws were either gender blind or gender neutral, meaning either they do not consider gender-related issues, that being gender blind, or they distinguish based on gender, that is gender neutral, or they do not distinguish based on gender, which is gender neutral. So we then explored these issues through 3 surveys. And this was the first time that DELF had gone out into the world and collected primary data for the State of the Sector report. And that was a very challenging exercise, but it was greatly contributed by the DELF community and a lot of the people on this call, actually. So, and what we found is that when we targeted government officials, women in mining groups, and the miners themselves, we got a full picture of the role of women in ASM and the barriers and opportunities to their full participation in the sector. We had a total of 1,900 respondents, and 67% of them were female. And I suppose, yeah, I'll close out my section really by saying thank you so much to everybody who helped undertake the data collection process. It obviously would not have been possible without you. And I'll hand over back to Nate.
Great, thanks, Itai. Susan, you can go to the next slide. So just here, again, three of the main recommendations that came out of the report, and we're going to be talking about the first one was the making mining laws and economic policies gender inclusive today, but there's two other chapters in the report that focus on social protections and one on occupational health and safety. So make sure to check those out as well. And go to the next slide, Susan. Just to share a few of the kind of snapshot findings like I spoke of, we talked a little bit about the government survey that was done to look at both mining codes as well as land legal tenure frameworks and the role of kind of gender blind versus gender sensitive mining codes and contrasting those. And so really in that recognition, we found also that governments themselves were advocating for the need to improve their own capabilities internally and operations to support women in ASM. And so we'll talk a little bit about that now with our case study authors and lead chapter author as well. But additionally, within this first chapter, there's a lot of context around how there's a need for capacity building for government officials as well as financial support, but also the role of cultural beliefs and other social systems that also impact women's perceptions and roles in the mining space. So looking at both legal frameworks, but also looking at the impact of social and cultural practices. And so really, how can those work together to be aligned, and what can the role of mining laws play in the sector itself? So I want to pull down maybe the slides now and invite Nellie, Professor Nellie Mutameri to join the conversation here.
Nate, thank you very much. It's fantastic to be here. I hope you can all hear me.
Excellent.
Nate,
we can hear you.
You can.
Yes,
Fantastic.
We can hear you, Nellie.
Because sometimes you can be talking to yourself when you do this remote connections.
Indeed.
Anyway, yeah. It's fantastic to be here and to have an opportunity to talk about some of the findings from this work. I would really like to start by thanking the World Bank for making this work possible, particularly with its partnership with Pact, and also all the authors and researchers and women in mining groups that have contributed to this work. Data for providing an evidence base is absolutely essential for policy making and strategy formulation. And I would like to thank you, Nate, and your colleagues for organizing this session, as well as the other sessions that have been associated with. So back to your question about discrimination in law as one of the major findings of this report. Discrimination against women in law is a really significant barrier to how women can equally participate in the artisanal and small-scale mining sector, the ASM sector. So when legal frameworks, as you and Itai mentioned, when they are gender blind and gender neutral, they fail to recognize the fact that they need to be able to address the specific needs of women and challenges that they face. What that does is perpetuating gender disparities within the sector. I have a couple of examples of how this actually plays out, and this talk to access to land and resources. It talks to license and permitting. Another example is around issues of safety and well-being, as well as representation and decision-making. So to the first one, access to land resources. So in many countries, customary land tenure systems or traditional practices often favor men over women in terms of owning land, in terms of access to mineral resources. So gender-blind legal frameworks may fail to address these disparities, therefore leaving women without secure access to land for mining activities. As an example, you have inheritance laws which oftentimes prioritize male heirs. It means women are then excluded from inheriting land where mining operations can occur, and thus limiting their ability to be able to participate in the ASM sector. On the second issue that I pointed out is licensing and permitting. Obtaining licenses and permits, as we all know, given the type of people that are operating in the sector, is complex and quite costly. Gender-blind legal frameworks may not consider these additional barriers that women face in navigating these processes. As an example, licensing procedures require significant amount of capital or finance or funds, as well as technical expertise. We will know from the demographics of many developing countries where ASM is active that women often have lower education levels to men. They often have reduced or less access to financial resources. And therefore, because they are already disadvantaged like this, they will be disproportionately disadvantaged in how or when they try to obtain the permits that make it possible for them to engage in ASM formally, because only when you actually engaging formally can you actually optimize ASM as a livelihood activity. The third area that I mentioned is safety and well-being. Gender-blind legal frameworks may overlook this unique safety and health risks that women face in the ASM sector. So what that does is that it exposes women to hazardous working conditions where they don't have adequate PPE, where they don't have the healthcare services that are specifically required by women because they are women. As an example, if mining regulations do not address issues around sexual harassment or gender-based violence at mining sites, you can see that women can then face increasing vulnerability to exploitation and abuse, just making their situation even more precarious than it originally is. On the last item that I mentioned, which is representation in decision-making, gender-blind legal frameworks may fail to actually promote gender diversity and inclusion in decision-making processes. What this does is that it means that there's a lack of representation of women's perspectives and interest in policy development and implementation. And if one example is that if mining laws do not mandate gender balanced representation in regulatory bodies or in frameworks within communities that oversee mining activities, women are then marginalized in these decision-making forums and therefore affecting how their livelihoods and well-being actually plays out in the ASM sector. So overall, I would like to just point out that discrimination against women in law exacerbates the already existing gender disparities, inequalities in the ASM sector because they reinforce social norms and practices that limit women's opportunities for empowerment and how they can actually effectively participate in decision-making processes. And therefore, if we're going to promote gender equality in ASM, we have to think about legal frameworks that recognize and address these specific needs that address, and also the challenges that women specifically face in the ASM sector. Nate, I would like to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nelly. That's some really practical kind of examples of the importance of gender-sensitive legal frameworks against a number of different components. I think about the occupational health and safety considerations, and one of our case studies we have from Rwanda, which is very practical intervention looking at providing rechargeable head torches for women and really how that made a difference in terms of women's ability to participate underground in mining activities in Rwanda. So encourage folks to check that out in our third chapter. We also had a great case study from South Africa that looked at kind of considerations for female miners' participation in formalization efforts by the government and what kind of considerations need to be given to capacity building, but also to training and requirements that the government had set out, and how that in some ways excluded women, but also in other ways was able to create inclusion as well. So there's some great case studies that I encourage folks to check out as well, just a taste of two of those there as well. Maybe Nelly, just one of the, so we talked about kind of this major finding about 67% of national mining codes and 80% of legal frameworks that were reviewed being gender blind or gender neutral. We also found in the government survey that we did asking governments around their kind of efforts around gender equality that 83% of government officials that were surveyed stated that they considered or included women in formalization interventions, and that 67% said they had undertaken women or programs specifically to empower women in ASM. It seems like we have this kind of disconnect a little bit between the legal frameworks being gender blind and gender neutral, but we're hearing from these governments that were surveyed the real importance or inclusion of women in these efforts. Is there any perspective you could offer maybe on what this might mean, why we have this disconnect between legal frameworks maybe, but also government's recognition of the importance of women in the sector and what that might mean going forward?
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting finding from the research and the data that was collected, and also from the case studies. So this disconnect between gender blind legal frameworks and the fact that, so it's almost like I don't know if oxymoron is the right word. So on one hand, you have governments who are responsible for legal frameworks, having these gender blind legal frameworks that do a disservice to women's participation. And then on the other hand, when you speak to the government officials, they actually tell you that they do recognize the importance of women in the ASM sector. I can cite a few factors which might be attributed to this. It can be the lack of gender mainstreaming policy in policy implementation. It can be institutional barriers. It can also be cultural and societal norms as well as might also be limited consultation and participation. So on lack of gender mainstreaming in policy implementation, I think while government officials do recognize the importance of women in the ASM sector and openly express intentions and sometimes actually include them in formalization interventions as well as empowerment programs, there may be a failure to then effectively translate these intentions to actual concrete actions that are reflected within legal frameworks. So even though they are involving women in some of these interventions, it continues to be an ad hoc approach with no grounding in law. And as we know, law is what makes it sustainable, because if it's ad hoc, once the intervention and the fund have gone away, then you lose that sustainability. And therefore, gender considerations are not mainstreamed into policy development and implementation processes. Obviously, it's not all gloom and doom. The fact that these government officials are actually recognizing is a step in the right direction. In fact, if I can go out on a limb and give ourselves the benefit of the doubt, one can say in the evolution of frameworks, we have started the journey, we just haven't arrived there. And one of the things around how soon or if we will arrive is around institutional barriers. Government agencies responsible for putting in place mining laws and policies and implementing them may have lack of capacity to be able to do this and not having enough resources, or it may be even as blatant as not having the political will to prioritize gender equality in their mandates. So what this does is that it leads to a disconnect between the high level of commitments that we see to gender equality and the actual implementation of making sure that the legal frameworks actually reflect this. The third area around cultural norms, even government officials do fall prey to cultural and societal norms. So these deeply ingrained cultural societal norms, whether by the people that are supposed to put in place these frameworks or by the stakeholders that influence what they put in place with regarding to gender roles and responsibilities, may actually influence decision-making processes within government institutions. So despite recognizing that it's important, women are important for the ASM sector in terms of their productivity, in terms of producing minerals, these prevailing attitudes and norms actually continue to hinder the efforts to address these gender disparities that we find within legal frameworks. And lastly, I think that in as much as this recognition from government officials that women are important for ASM, but I think whether it's because they don't have the capacity or they don't want to, or they don't resource it for whatever reason, they oftentimes there isn't the effective engagement that allows women to be able to influence the processes. For example, governments may not be consulting with grassroots organizations to make sure that the needs of women are actually addressed. I think I can stop there, Nate, and maybe you can pose the next question. Thank you.
Thank you, Nelly. I think that's a number of interesting examples or tries to ways to frame that kind of, like you said, oxymoron or juxtaposition we found between the legal framework positioning, but also government's efforts and intentions. One of the things, maybe just to kind of reverse, we talked a little bit about the 67% of national mining codes that were gender blind or gender neutral. Can you talk a little bit maybe about the inverse, right? The opposites, those that were maybe positive examples where we did find gender sensitive policies had been adopted in mining codes, and what did that mean for female participation in the sector? Had it kind of caught up, or were there any kind of positive examples we could see where that was gender sensitive legal frameworks were in place?
Yeah, no, thank you, Nate. Yes, definitely there were some positive examples where gender-sensitive policies have been adopted in mining frameworks. I can cite examples from Colombia, and I'm glad that one of the case studies that we have in this session is from Colombia, also from Peru, from South Africa, Tanzania, and Zambia in Africa. What these countries have done is to incorporate gender consideration in the mining frameworks in two examples, by setting gender targets and also by enacting laws that actually promote women's equal access to the sector. I won't delve much into the Colombia case study because we have somebody who's much more informed about this case study, but all I can mention now is that gender equality guidelines have been put in place to be able to promote gender equality. Another case study that demonstrated this positive examples is Peru, where the provisions for women's equal access and benefits have been incorporated in the mining code and the legal framework. And in this particular case study from Peru, what was highlighted was that women were included in the process of creating regulations. In addition to the fact that obviously the geology lended itself to women participating better, women were afforded opportunities to learn and also to access technologies. So, but all in all, by recognizing incorporating gender-sensitive policies, what this case study demonstrated was that you could then have positive impact in terms of increasing the female representation within the mining sector. The three other examples, South Africa, Tanzania, and Zambia, are the examples where the mining frameworks actually include gender targets in demonstrating that these governments are actually committed to promoting gender equality in the mining sector. So all in all, these efforts show that it's promising. There's promise towards fostering more inclusive, gender equitable ASM sector, and that there are examples that other countries that actually want to follow suit can actually learn from. Thank you, Nate.
Thank you, Nelly, and thank you for that. I think, again, allusions to some of the other case studies. We have a great one on Peru in this chapter as well that talks a little bit more about the efforts there to include women in the sector. And so I want to now, I know I'll come back to you, Nelly, for the group discussion, but I want to invite Maria Camila Gomez, who's the author of our fascinating case study we've been alluding to about ASM formalization in Colombia, to join me. And Susan, you can pull up Camila's slides as well. While you're doing that, just an introduction. Maria Camila Gomez is a gender and human rights specialist at the Alliance for Responsible Mining in Bogota, Colombia. She's a sociologist and specialist in gender-based violence studies with experience in implementation of community projects with different population groups in women, especially in Colombia, Honduras, and Bolivia. And she has an excellent case study in the State of the Sector report this year that speaks about efforts that were done in Colombia, working really constructively with a group of female miners to become formally recognized as a miner collective. So I know, Camila, you have some slides here you can share with us. I think from my perspective, I'm really interested in how you, as an organization, looked at data to really influence what type of intervention and approaches that you guys used to really work with women in these communities and influence their role in the sector, as well as the visibility towards their participation. So Camila, I'll turn it over to you. I know you have some slides you can share with us, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Hola, muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Espero estén muy bien. Gracias por la invitación a este espacio, donde la idea es hablarles un poco sobre este caso de estudio en el cual nos enfocamos en cómo la formalización minera apoya y garantiza un poco los derechos humanos de las mujeres. Please, next slide. Para este caso, es importante tener en cuenta cómo hemos avanzado en materia de política pública en Colombia, donde la política pública define la minería de subsistencia como minería artesanal en 2 puntos. En el primer punto vemos que se define algo llamado bariqueo. El bariqueo es una forma de lavado de arenas manual donde se separa el mineral mediante técnicas artesanales, y la otra es la selección de material, que es una forma de recolectar y procesar manualmente lo que se consideran desperdicios de las pequeñas mineras. Esta actividad en su mayoría la realizan mujeres, no solo en Colombia, sino en muchos de los países de Latinoamérica donde nosotros hemos trabajado, hemos identificado eso, y acá en Colombia las cifras nos dicen que cerca del 90% de minería artesanal es practicada por mujeres. Next slide, please. Para este caso de estudio en especial nos enfocamos en 4 puntos específicos, que son los que están viendo en pantalla, donde identificamos cuáles han sido las principales brechas, barreras que han tenido para este caso un grupo de mujeres en Suárez, Cauca, que más adelante una de ellas tendrá la oportunidad también contarnos un poco de esa experiencia. Pero entonces, dentro de los procesos de formalización que nosotros en Colombia hemos apoyado, para este caso específico de un grupo de mujeres llamadas Asomos Lupaz, hemos identificado que la formalización ha contribuido a que puedan tener mejores condiciones financieras, mayor reconocimiento e impacto no solo en su comunidad, sino a nivel nacional e internacional. No obstante, a nivel Colombia hemos encontrado que aún existen brechas para poder recoger información sobre lo que es la minería de subsistencia, debido a que existen barreras tecnológicas que impiden que las mujeres puedan acceder a estos procesos de formalización y que esto además está acompañado de las barreras de información que hay a nivel institucional, donde las entidades locales lamentablemente todavía no cuentan con la completa capacidad de poder acompañar este proceso de las mujeres. Además, esto también se ve impactado debido a las barreras que hay de manera financiera, ya que muchas entidades que pueden ofrecer procesos de bancarización a las mujeres no lo hacen debido a los prejuicios que todavía existen por parte de la minería artesanal y de pequeña escala. Otro de los puntos importantes que trabajamos es el impacto del mercurio. Estas zonas, aunque en Colombia ya está prohibido el uso del mercurio, no es secreto que estas zonas están impactadas por años anteriores donde se hacía uso no regulado de este elemento, que implica que entonces el ecosistema se ha impactado en gran manera. Y si recuerdan lo que les mencionaba anteriormente, el barequeo, por ejemplo, que es realizado en zonas, en afluentes hídricas como ríos, quebradas, hace que si las mujeres van allá a realizar su actividad minera sin una adecuado uso de elementos de protección personal, pues el río y la contaminación que hay en este las va a afectar a ellas, a su salud y también el de su comunidad. No solo por la minería, sino también, por ejemplo, por consumo de alimentos, entre otras actividades. Por otro lado, tenemos en cuenta aspectos de gobernanza, donde identificamos que los procesos de asociatividad permiten una gran visibilidad de las mujeres, ya que de manera individual existen igual estas brechas para la formalización, pero que de manera articulada ellas pueden acceder mejor y fácilmente a servicios financieros, a participar, por ejemplo, de construcción de política pública, a ser tenidas en cuenta en diferentes espacios de toma de decisión que tienen que ver con la MAPE, pero que todavía hoy en día desconocen el rol de las mujeres en estos procesos. Además, los procesos de gobernanza también nos han demostrado que es una manera de poder transitar hacia medios de vida alternativos, donde las mujeres puedan no solo ejercer la minería, sino que puedan transitar a otras formas de subsistencia que les permitan mayor independencia y autonomía económica. Por último, y un aspecto transversal a todos los puntos que les hemos mencionado, está el tema de violencias basadas en género. ¿Qué pasa con esto? Que los procesos, digamos, de formalización acompañados de sensibilizaciones sobre violencias basadas en género nos han demostrado que eso permite que las mujeres puedan reconocer cuáles son las violencias en toda la cadena de suministro de oro a las cuales están sometidas, y este reconocimiento permite que también puedan generar y exigir procesos donde se pueda acompañar y donde se pueda mitigar, prevenir y eliminar estas violencias a las cuales están siendo sometidas. Esto además también ha permitido que en materia de política pública, al menos en Colombia, hemos avanzado un poco en identificar estas violencias y en activar rutas institucionales que acompañen a las mujeres. Ahora los dejo con Divaney, que ella también quiere contarles un poco sobre su experiencia, sobre pues, los procesos que han llevado desde Musulupaz, lo cual fue inspiración para para este estudio de caso. Adelante, Divaney.
Bueno, muy buenos días. Mi nombre es Divaney Viveros Durán, del municipio de Suárez, Cauca, minera de subsistencia. Hago parte de la Asociación de Mujeres Asomusolupaz, Asociación de Mujeres Seleccionadoras y Luchadoras por la Paz del municipio de Suárez. Nos conformamos en el 2017. En este momento somos 35 mujeres que hacemos parte de la asociación. Para nosotros la formalización ha sido algo muy positivo que se ha reflejado en nuestras vidas, ya que esto nos ha ayudado a un punto muy clave, donde nos hemos visibilizado. En estos momentos ya somos invitadas a espacios, ya somos tenidas en cuenta. Pues miren nomás ahora que gracias a Alianza por la Minería Responsable, somos visibilizadas. Hemos estado en espacios muy importantes como en la Embajada de los Estados Unidos y la Universidad de Rosario en procesos mineros. Hemos sido invitadas. También estamos siendo visibilizadas por parte del gobierno. De igual manera, pues decirlo también, hay brechas que aún debemos entrelazar entre las comunidades y el gobierno para que conozcan realmente las realidades y así podamos como avanzar en esos procesos. A las mujeres mineras de Colombia, de del mundo, yo les diría que este proceso es muy importante, que no tengan miedo al hacer este paso, porque es un paso que nos ayuda a visibilizarnos, nos ayuda a que seamos escuchadas, nos ayuda a que seamos tenidas en cuenta a la hora del gobierno o entidades en la toma de decisiones, ¿cierto? Porque como sabemos, la mujer minera no ha sido, como por decirlo, muy bien vista a través del gobierno, pero a través del paso que nosotras hemos dado a la formalización, ha sido un proceso muy bonito que agradecemos a Alianza por la Minería Responsable por habernos acogido y por habernos abierto el espacio donde en estos momentos hemos dado un paso muy importante que fue a realizar una venta piloto que tuvimos en Medellín con una entidad ANESPO. Gracias a eso hemos podido avanzar en procesos como en género y en derechos humanos. Gracias a eso somos mujeres emprendedoras y luchadoras que sabemos ya defender nuestros derechos, que sabemos que el sector minero, nosotras como seleccionadoras somos un punto de equilibrio en nuestro país. Y qué más les cuento. Y pues también hay cosas que pues a través del gobierno tenemos que ir como entrelazando, ¿cierto? Porque eso nos sirve para el mejoramiento de nuestras vidas. A las mujeres mineras yo les quiero decir que vivan esa experiencia y que traspasen ese paso a la formalización, porque es un paso que nos ayuda a porque ustedes saben que una sola mujer no hace nada. En cambio, unidas, asociadas, vamos a lograr muchas cosas. Vamos a hacer, nos tienen en cuenta en proyectos alternos, nos tienen en cuenta para la toma de decisiones. ¿Sí?
Fantastic. Thank you, Devani and Camila for that excellent presentation. I apologize to folks if there was any issues with the translation. I know it might have been a little bit choppy, but I think what we heard, you know, and that point at the end, Devani, from you, really about the importance of uniting, right, and what we can do as individuals, but really when you bring women together in a collective, what's been done by ARM and the work with Esimula Paz, the association represented in Colombia as well for women. So I think what we can do maybe is bring back Nelly into our discussion. We can open up kind of our panel discussion. And I think one of the findings we could maybe discuss a little bit about, and it alludes to this case study, but also a broader finding from the sector survey, was really around this role of women in mining groups and how mining associations, specifically grouping women together, were a key intervention point for governments when they looked at how they considered women's needs in the sector. And so we had 10 out of 12 governments that we surveyed. When they spoke about including women in developing ASM interventions, they spoke specifically and cited engaging with women in mining groups. And so I think one of the kind of questions maybe we could ask here is what did you find, I guess, Nelly, from our kind of review as well, looking at women in mining groups and their roles, and where can they be strengthened, or what potential, you know, opportunities do we need to think about scaling up these groups? And maybe that's the same question for you, Camila and Devani. Where does the next step go in terms of growing the work you've done to organize women and really enhancing their visibility, but also scalability to more geographies and municipalities across your national and local contexts?
Nate, thank you very much. And I just want to say thank you to our case study presenters. I think it was fantastic, the presentation of the case study from Colombia. I'm a woman in mining. I'm a geologist, and I've been working in the mining sector for a long time. And there is no doubt that getting women organized into groups is absolutely important for advancing gender equality and sustainable development within the sector. And this applies to the ASM sector as well. And how this happens is through advocacy, through capacity building interventions, just simple networking. Some women in mining organizations are better resourced or more advanced to actually conduct research themselves, or at least participate in kind of practical action-oriented research where they're not only just learning, but sharing their own experiences amongst each other. And as well as community engagement initiatives. So this is how women in mining groups can actually empower the members and the women in their sectors within the different countries and the different regions. What women in mining groups do for women is that they're able to represent their interests because they're women themselves, they understand it better. And through this, they're able to actually also support enhancing skills. I can think of a number of examples from the case studies that we interacted with during this report, and also from my other work in Africa and some other regions of the world where ASM exists. Women definitely support fostering collaboration, and what that does, particularly when they participate in research initiatives, they're also generating evidence-based insights into how gender equality can actually be brought into the ASM sector. What women also do is supporting community developments. You will find many examples about community development projects that are maybe around village level savings clubs or accessing markets where women actually come together and support each other. So there is the value of women in mining is absolutely important. And it is because of what women have been doing for themselves that governments have actually now realized that the best and most effective way to interface with mining is through an organized women who can speak for the mandate of women, who can represent their interests and advocate for their needs. In as much as we still have a long way to go to make sure that we have gender responsive policies and legal frameworks, but that recognition is there. And I think we're on the path, and I think it is going to be reflected in how women are able to improve their financial literacy, how women are able to access services that enable them to effectively participate in mining and have meaningful livelihoods out of the sector and the opportunity that ASM presents to them in their communities. Nate, I would like to end there and leave it to my colleagues from the case study from Colombia. Thank you.
Thank you, Nelly. Maybe Camila or Devon, if you want to jump in just on this thoughts around what does it take to scale women in mining groups? What can we replicate from the great work you've done, or in other contexts? What do you see as kind of barriers to growing or expanding this, enabling factors?
Listo, muchas gracias, Nathan y Nelly. Bueno, respecto a temas de marco regulatorio, es importante que dentro del trabajo que nosotros en ARM realizamos, el principal objetivo es dar voz y permitir que los mismos grupos de mujeres se puedan poner en contacto con las entidades, que estas relaciones de gobernanza sean sólidas y sean fuertes. En ese marco de ideas, nosotros hemos trabajado en diferentes proyectos en Honduras, Nicaragua, Colombia, Perú, y seguimos, digamos, extendiéndonos, donde el primer punto a trabajar siempre ha sido la identificación de estos grupos de mujeres mineras que se encuentran en los territorios y que son socialmente excluidos porque muchas veces no las consideran mineras y no las consideran relevantes dentro de la cadena de suministro. Entonces ahí está la primera barrera, identificar que ellas existen, qué rol cumplen, qué tipo de minería realizan, y esta identificación además alineada a lo que son las violencias por razones de género que ellas experimentan, porque muchas veces la política pública que se construye a partir de la MAPE y del impacto de la minería artesanal y pequeña escala ignora esto, cuando ellas son un grupo altamente vulnerable y que generalmente se ubican en zonas periféricas con una gran ausencia de presencia estatal y pues enmarcadas en diferentes situaciones que les generan ciertas brechas de acceso y de garantía de derechos. Además, nosotros, después de superar como este proceso de identificación, lo que hemos hecho a nivel normativo es entablar estos diálogos multiactor donde las mujeres sean sus propias representantes, donde ellas mismas puedan contar con una participación activa, con una voz que les permita mostrar cuál es su realidad y cuáles son las necesidades que tienen, y que las entidades puedan comprender esto y puedan adecuar las políticas acorde a estos procesos. Porque algo que les mencionaba anteriormente y que no solo pasa en Colombia, que lo hemos visto en diferentes países, es que la política, hemos avanzado en política pública. Sí, hoy en día en Colombia reconocemos el rol de la mujer minera, tenemos una política de minería de subsistencia, tenemos lineamientos de género para el sector minero energético. No obstante, todavía nos falta avanzar en que esta política se adapte realmente a los contextos de las mujeres, porque entonces hay unas brechas tecnológicas, hay unas brechas de información, hay unas brechas de acceso a recursos que las mujeres no tienen y que el Estado debería garantizar para poder cumplir y materializar realmente la política, las políticas que se hacen en torno a las mujeres y la minería artesanal y de pequeña escala.
Excellent. Thank you, Camila. I think that's very important, right? You talked about inclusion there and the importance of inclusion, and also women speaking, in their own voice and telling their own stories about their experience with gender-based violence for other contexts, as well as kind of at the issue kind of remaining still about access to resources and things that are kind of preventing women from accessing, if it's access to land tenure, access to finance, other issues that were themes that came up across the State of the Sector report. I want to see if we have any questions from the chat. If there's anyone that's joining us that would love to ask a question to our panelists, feel free to put that into the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you as well to join the conversation. Maybe while folks are thinking of that, again, another thing we found in the report was really this issue around government capacity building, and really the recognition of the desire for government to include women in interventions and things, but also this issue really around lack of funding that government pointed to, as well as lack of capacity from government officials. I don't know if that's been your experience in Colombia, Camila or Devani, when you engagements with governments and their awareness or around kind of this gender sensitive mining policy frameworks or gender equality in the sector itself, if there's things you've come up with there, or Nelly, if you've seen this as well. But I think it was an interesting kind of finding from the report, really government pointing to both lack of funding, but also asking for capacity building around this topic specifically, knowing that they weren't at the mark maybe to reach what was the ideal view around gender inclusion. Any thoughts from either of you, Devani, Camila, and Nelly, on that kind of issue that we saw in the report around government's needs specifically for capacity building and financing to support this gender equality agenda?
Camila, you want me to go first? I'm happy to.
Thank you.
Or you can go. Okay, sure. So Nate, no, it was a very important finding. I think one of the things that I mentioned earlier was there's institutional barriers that might be the reason for the disconnect between the intentions and then providing policy and legal basis which provides sustainability to interventions. And so capacity definitely is one of those issues. So governments will need some training and capacity building programs to make sure that they're able to focus on gender sensitivity and the understanding what women's rights means, how to identify the specific challenges that women actually need. So there are knowledge and skills gaps that actually need to be closed. I think workshops, seminars, online courses, peer-to-peer learning exchanges, and I can share the fact that we are actually conducting some training in Nigeria in a couple of weeks on issues of gender in ASM, and how you optimize those learnings is, I think, one of the things that the internet has done is democratize access to information and knowledge. And I think this is one platform which we are doing right now, which can be the basis of actually enhancing the capacity of governments to actually be able to put in place, first of all, to understand and generate the evidence that is needed, and then put in place well-informed and well-structured policy and legal frameworks. Yeah, over to you, Camila. Thank you.
Sí, pues,
qué pena.
Dale, Divaney.
Sí, yo quisiera como aportar un poquito en esta pregunta, porque sí pienso que, sí, el gobierno debería de ayudar más con herramientas, y con fortalecimiento en proyectos que nos beneficien a las mujeres mineras, ya que nosotras aportamos a la economía del país, que nos tengan en cuenta a la hora de toma de decisiones, ¿cierto? Porque a veces pues las entidades o el gobierno a través de las oficinas toman decisiones, pero realmente no se dan cuenta de la necesidad que nosotras en territorio vivimos. Entonces eso sería como, o sea, para mí, para nosotros como mujeres mineras, sí que las entidades vayan a los territorios, conozcan nuestras realidades y a partir de ahí tomen decisiones que nos ayuden a nosotros en proyectos, que nos ayuden a nosotros en acompañamiento y también con financiación, porque sabemos que a veces si no hay los recursos necesarios, pues va a venir un proyecto, lo van a socializar, pero a la vez, como no hay financiación, no va a poder realizarse o llevarse a cabo. Y pues nosotras como comunidad y como mineras y como mujeres lo que queremos es que si vienen al territorio a través del gobierno, de las entidades, que se desarrollen los proyectos, que las propuestas que traigan se hagan una realidad. Para nosotros eso sería muy bueno. Gracias.
Por mi parte, respecto a lo que preguntabas, Nathan, por ejemplo, en Colombia estamos haciendo un tránsito hacia economías verdes, hacia la eliminación de grandes industrias extractivas, todo lo que, pues digamos, los temas que están alrededor de eso, y eso implica un poco la baja inversión hacia lo que es el sector minero energético. Entonces, esto, claro, impacta fuertemente en lo que es la inversión hacia todo el sector en general, pero ahí hay un gran desconocimiento sobre lo que sería en este caso el sector de la MAPE, de minería artesanal y de pequeña escala, que sí requiere una mayor y especial atención para poder hacer este tránsito hacia pues digamos, hacia lo que este gobierno espera sobre temas de minería, pero pues digamos, hemos avanzado un montón en políticas que tienen en cuenta a las mujeres en el sector de la MAPE. Sin embargo, hace falta mayor inversión y que esta inversión realmente se vea materializada en los diferentes territorios, que como les mencionaba antes, son territorios pues marginados, periféricos, y que hay una ausencia igual del Estado.
Excellent. Thank you, Devani and Camilla and Nelly for those interventions. And I think that's some really powerful messaging, right, from Devani, especially seeing kind of bringing government to see the reality and the experience of women mining and what's really needed in terms of investments, like you spoke about, Camilla, as well, on the ground to see the inclusion and opportunity that's there to support local development through women mining organizations and miners themselves and the sector itself. So I would see we're up a little bit over the hour here, but I want to give you both all the chance if there's any last kind of word or intervention you want to share. I know we have a question from a colleague in Nigeria just asking kind of, again, how can we spell out in mining legislation what does it mean to take women's rights and more involvement in the mining sector? What does that mean from a legislative perspective or others? So maybe if you have a final word to offer here as we think about this topic of rights and resources and fostering gender equality in mining frameworks, any last words you'd give our audience here to take with them as they kind of continue on in this process? Last word. Anyone want to jump in? Nelly, Camilla, Devani?
Yeah, I can jump in. I was offering Camilla and Devani the opportunity to go first for a change, but I'm happy to just say a few words, if that's okay. I can continue. I think one of the things around capacity building specifically, and I think it also talks to the point that our colleague from Nigeria is bringing up, is the issue of generating and analyzing gender disaggregated data. And I think that without that essential evidence base, it's difficult to convince stakeholders, and also it's difficult to actually have policies and frameworks and legal frameworks that are actually responsive to first of all, that importance, which I think for now the fact that governments officials are willing and being warm towards women is more a feeling, unless there is actual hard data to actually support that, and also provide baselines for setting targets, then we have a real gap. So I think that a lot of work still needs to go into supporting governments to be able to generate that data and also analyze it in a way that actually allows them to make the appropriate decisions around policy making and also monitoring the interventions that they're implementing. Thank you. Over to Devani and Camila. Thank you.
Bueno, respecto al tema de cómo involucrar en la legislación, un poco retomando lo que ya hemos dicho, es hacer este trabajo interinstitucional, es fundamental para poder avanzar en materia legislativa, entendiendo que no es una entidad la que desarrolla o implementa las políticas públicas, sino que son una serie de entidades que de manera organizada deben apoyar a los grupos de mujeres. Está el tema de identificación, lo que hablábamos al inicio, de reconocer el rol de las mujeres, reconocer las violencias por las cuales están atravesadas. Y esto, digamos, nosotros desde Alianza por la Minería Responsable hemos visto mucho la importancia de pensarnos no solo el desarrollo de una minería artesanal responsable, sino también cómo promovemos la autonomía económica en estos grupos de mujeres. Porque la autonomía económica nos ha demostrado que les permite salir mucho de los ciclos de violencia. ¿Qué significa esto? Que transitar a medios de vida alternativos va a permitir que las mujeres no solamente hagan un trabajo minero que les permite subsistir, sino que además pueden transitar a formas de trabajo justo, de trabajo digno, y que la política pública puede pensarse y desarrollar esto. Acá en Colombia ya han dado primeros pasos desde la Dirección de Formalización del Ministerio de Minas y Energía. Sin embargo, aún existen brechas en cómo introducir el enfoque de género. Básicamente, para poder iniciar esto, necesitamos con urgencia que las entidades se acerquen y conozcan la realidad de las mujeres, tal como Divaney lo mencionaba.
Yo también quiero aportar un poquito. También yo pienso que estas brechas se pueden lograr con la voluntad, ¿no? Que el gobierno tenga una supremamente voluntad de ayudar y que de pronto no ponga tantas trabas a la hora de nosotras iniciar un proceso. Porque a veces iniciamos un proceso con dichas normas o dichos requisitos que tenemos que cumplir. Cuando ya cumplimos esos requisitos, vemos que el gobierno llega y saca otros. Entonces nosotros quedamos ahí como, sí, entonces eso también falta como de voluntad de parte del gobierno a la hora de cuando nos exija un documento que sea ese, y simplemente nosotras, y que nosotras podamos cumplir. Gracias.
Excellent. Thank you, Devani and Camila and Nelly, for those final points, really around recognizing the importance of collaboration across stakeholders, not just government's role, but the role of really helping organizations as well as associations to be able to voice the concerns, as well as to play the part that they can with their capacities and intervention areas. And Nelly, the point that you made about data as well, and the importance of data being kind of a key linchpin for really articulating and moving beyond maybe goodwill towards this, but really practically understanding what kind of policies are needed. So thank you so much. It's really, I think it's been an encouraging panel to hear from our case study authors and Nelly and everyone. Thank you all for joining us. We're gonna wrap this up now. What I will say is we have this recording. It'll be posted on the DELF YouTube page, as well as the previous event recordings. You can check those out. We encourage you to also look at the report, to download it, share it among your constituencies. Reach out to us if you'd like for us to speak more about that. We're happy to kind of continue to promote this and the great work of the number of organizations and contributors that we had a part of this report. Thank you to all of them, and thank you to you all for joining us. Really appreciate taking the time on this important topic. And so with that, thank you all, and look forward to connecting in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Gracias. Gracias a ustedes por el espacio.
Bye, everybody.
Chao.
Thank you. Gracias.
Aquí.